What would be the word that we would typically use for this person? One who comes from a foreign country into a city or land to reside there by the side of the natives. What would be the word? That's a technical definition of what? While you're thinking, I'll give you a clue, and then read with me Hebrews chapter 11, verses 13 through 16. Hebrews 11, this of course was primarily been talking about Abraham and Sarah, but would include others. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared a city for them. Stranger would work, but pilgrim especially fits. That's this definition. We would call this person a pilgrim. Have you ever met a pilgrim before? I don't mean some caricature at the Thanksgiving Day parade in New York City. Have you ever met a pilgrim? Are you a pilgrim? You ever think of yourself in that way? The past few weeks we've looked at God called them saints, God called them disciples, God called them Christians. And so in that line of thought, I want to think today about pilgrims. What does it mean to be a pilgrim? This is a little bit difficult for us to relate to by experience. Although living in Alaska, maybe you had that experience. But for most 21st century Americans, we read about pilgrims. We see a picture of pilgrims around the end of November, but it can be difficult for us to relate to, mainly because before you move to a new place, before you decide to go there, what do you typically do? Before you decide to move there, I did. It was October of 2018. We came for a week and a half or so to decide if we were going to move here. Usually, in America, before we move somewhere, we go there first. And we drive around a little bit and we get to know the natives and see if we think we can put up with the natives or if they would put up with us or not. That's how Americans usually move. There can be some exceptions, but I think that's the rule. And so the mindset of a pilgrim is one that most Americans today have not had to put on. But if we're seeking the same kinds of things that we read about here in Hebrews chapter 11, then we have to work through, whether by physical things we've ever experienced, the uncertainties and the travel of a pilgrim or not. We have to have the mindset of a pilgrim because we have to be a pilgrim. And so how do we put on that hat? How do we wear those shoes if we haven't had to do so before? Well, Hebrews chapter 11 is full of strangers and pilgrims, but especially Abraham and Sarah are people that we can easily, because of the details that we know about their life, we can look at their lives and say, here was the life of a stranger and a pilgrim, people who spent most of their life in a foreign land. And so if we can understand their life and their mind that led to that life, then we can begin to understand and to have the mind of a pilgrim and therefore to be a pilgrim. This morning is mostly going to be a history lesson of the life of Abraham and Sarah as pilgrims. And there will be some application that will be obvious as we go through, but tonight the lesson will be on the same topic but focused more on our lives and the similarities of our lives and our faith that make us a pilgrim and that overlap with the life of Abraham and Sarah. So this morning, focus with me on the life of Abraham and Sarah. If you want to go back to Genesis chapter 12, and you might mark that as well, and we'll kind of be flipping back forth between Hebrews 11 and Genesis for most of our study this morning. It's easy to picture the people of Hebrews chapter 11 as some of the great heroes of faith. Sometimes this chapter is called the Hall of Faith because of the great faith of these people. I tend to shy away from calling it the Hall of Faith because in America, a Hall of Fame is a place that enshrines the names of people that you could never be like. You'll never be in the Football Hall of Fame. You probably will never be in the Country Music Hall of Fame. In America, halls of fame are usually for people who had these skills or some ability that was so unique that it set them apart from everybody else. And you go there to visit and kind of admire, wow, can't believe they could do that. How many times they caught a ball or how many strings they plucked. And wow, here's a string that they actually touched. But I could never be like them. That's usually what a Hall of Fame is. That may not be what we mean when we say that, so you can call it the Hall of Faith. That's fine. But if you call it that, be sure you understand that that particular part is not the point. The point is you can be like them. The end of Hebrews chapter 10, the context is some are struggling in their faith, and so here are people of faith. They're your great cloud of witnesses, the end of Hebrews 11, and so join them in the presence of God one day. First of all, Abraham and Sarah, we know them as people of great faith, but how did that happen? It happened because of great struggles. They did not come to faith easily. Think about the struggles of the lives of Abraham and Sarah. I won't turn back and read, but if you're back in Genesis 12 and you want to flip through their life, I'll mention a few of the chapters. But Abraham and Sarah ever sin? We have some of their sins recorded for us. And so they both dealt with the consequences of sin, both their own sin and the sin of other people that affected them. Abraham gave his wife up to be with, be in the harem of some in Egypt. Sarah lied. Well, I didn't laugh. Well, she did laugh. And so they faced the consequences of their own sins and the sins of others. They faced the constant appeal of material prosperity. For all of the life of Abraham and Sarah that we know of, they were materially prosperous. And so what the New Testament says about riches isn't some new revelation, is it? The deceitfulness of riches have always been true. And so they not only faced the deceitfulness of riches, they had the riches. And so they faced the challenges that go along with prosperity. They had the disappointments. They faced many disappointments in life. They had the disappointment of unfulfilled expectations. And so in Genesis chapter 15, Abraham had struggled. Well, God, you made this promise and it hasn't come true yet. And so how do I know? How can I be sure? He struggled with that. Sarah, of course, as well. Also in these chapters, you have the struggle of family strife. Did Abraham and Sarah always agree to every detail on everything? They had a few disagreements. There was strife within their home, and then you introduce Hagar to that picture, and then bring Ishmael into the picture, and so there were problems among their children. And anybody had family problems before? That contributed in the end to the faith of Abraham and Sarah. They faced the problem of anguish, the anguish that comes with death. In Genesis chapter 23, the death of Sarah. And so Abraham, he understood that, and that had to cause him to focus or to refocus again. He was a family man from everything that we can tell. But if his life was mainly wrapped up in his family, well, then what happens when Sarah is gone? Do any of these, maybe all of them, maybe some of them, any of these, would they be a summary of any part of your life and any part of your struggle? Well, God did not allow them, and even in some cases bring them into these trials to weaken their faith, but for the exact opposite purpose, right? God tested them, proved them by these things to help their faith to grow. And that was the result. Back in Hebrews chapter 11, that's why they are there. Their faith grew as a result of these things. And part of that is because they could face these temporary setbacks and struggles because they expected them. Because a pilgrim expects setbacks and struggles. and they'll endure them because where they are is not where they plan to be. And so they continue to press on. And that's what Abraham and Sarah did. They pressed on because God had made certain promises to them. And they were confident in those promises. Doesn't mean they never doubted, but they were confident in them and they never gave up that confidence. They were content with the promises of God. That's what a pilgrim does. He continues on. He may not like what he has, but he's content with where he's going. And then they also were pilgrims because they concentrated, they focused, they kept their mind and their faith centered on God and the promises that God made. So we're going to look at the promises of God and then their confidence and contentment and concentration on those promises. If you're in Genesis, go to Genesis chapter 12. What were some of the promises that God made to Abraham and Sarah and then their family? Genesis 12 is kind of a pivot point, a turn in the book of Genesis from the nations and from the ancients, and then really from Genesis 12, the rest of the book, isn't it? Is focused upon his family. Abraham and Sarah were pilgrims, not because they were a part of a reality show out on an island somewhere, but they were pilgrims because of the promises that God made. And the promises of God began with the commandments of God. In Genesis 12 and verse 1, the Lord had said to Abram, "Get out of your country and from your family and from your father's house to a land that I will show you." So all of the promises are conditioned upon Abraham. You have to leave your family. What if Abraham had never left his family? Never moved out of Ur of the Chaldeans? Well, the end story would not have changed. Christ still would have come. There just would have been maybe some other names and people involved. But God made this promise, or God gave this instruction. And we can learn a little bit more about Abraham and the promise, the instruction that God gave from Hebrews 11 and Acts chapter 7. But by faith, Abraham, however he had to struggle and work through the follow-through of the instructions that God gave, he did. And so he went, and God gave these primary promises. There's more than 3 promises here. But the main promises in Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 and 3, is that I will make you a great nation, in verse 2. And then in verse 3, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And then when he arrived in Canaan, when God showed him the land, then God said in verse 7, I will give this land to your descendants. And so here are the primary promises of God: the nation, the land, and the seed promise. And now go back to Hebrews chapter 11, because the promises of God to Abraham are not all contained here in Genesis chapter 12. There are definitely some other promises that we don't have a specific record of God speaking and telling Abraham about, but somehow Abraham knew about some other promises. That's what we just read from in verses 13 through 16. Just review with me, look with me again at verse 16. Why is it that Abraham and Sarah desired a heavenly country? What did they know about a heavenly country, and why did they think they could go to a heavenly country? Well, because God must have promised. The end of verse 16, He has prepared a city for them. How did they know that God had prepared a city for them? Well, we don't have a verse that tells us when God told Abraham about heaven and a heavenly city. And so sometimes maybe we don't think as much about that being a motivating factor for Abraham and Sarah. That's what Hebrews chapter 11 is saying was their primary motivation. They died in faith, not having received the promises. They received a portion of what God promised, but not all that God had promised. So why do they continue on and live their life as pilgrims among the natives? Why did they continue if while they were on this earth, they were not going to receive all of the promises? It's because they saw the promises afar off and were assured of them. And they desired a better country. Yet they desired for their descendants to receive the land. That was a part of it for sure. What Hebrews 11 is telling us is some detail not given in the book of Genesis, that Abraham and Sarah were motivated by their desire for a better country. And so they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. That's just how they viewed their life. And so their lives were based upon the promises of God. But just because God makes a promise doesn't mean anybody cares about it or that they remain confident in it. And so let's think about the role of their confidence in His promises that led them continuing to be the pilgrims and strangers that they were. Verse 13 of Hebrews 11, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were what? Were assured of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims. Faith and confidence. That's why Abraham and Sarah could be pilgrims, could have this mindset of being just here temporarily, wherever here is, and that certainly changed for them, because there was faith mixed with confidence. Look at verse 1 in Hebrews chapter 11. I typically read from the New King James Version, and so it reads this way here. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. I think there are some other translations that do a better job or maybe make it more clear. The American Standard Version, the English Standard, the New American Standard in the 1995 edition. New American Standard updates every once in a while, so sometimes the wording will be a little bit different. But these three that I mentioned translate Hebrews 11 verse 1 this way. Faith is assurance of things hoped for, a conviction of things not seen. That's important, because faith is not the substance of what we hope for. Faith is not the evidence of what we have not seen, but faith is the assurance, and faith is the conviction of what we hope for and have not seen. So some people make some false accusations when they talk about faith. Well, it's just blind faith. You think faith is your evidence. No, faith is not evidence. Believing something is not evidence of why you believe it, but faith is built upon the evidence, and faith is the assurance and the confidence of what you believe. In Genesis chapter 12, then, Abraham and Sarah showed their confidence in the promises of God when, after they had been with their family, of course in their youth, they stayed with their family, but then it was after the death of Abraham's father that in Genesis chapter 12, Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him. And so he took not just himself, but Sarah also submitted herself. I don't know how convinced she was. Maybe her faith was equally as strong, or maybe she said, well, where you go, I go. And so she went. But it was after the death of Abram's father. Acts chapter 7, verses 2 and 3 tells us that Abraham left his family and home and went out. That gives us a clue into the confidence that was mixed with his faith, because staying with family is typically valued in life, maybe even more so back in his time, but the nature of their work and their wealth. There was strength in numbers with their livestock and such. So for Abram, after the death of his father, to leave his family and the familiarity and the comfort that comes with being with family, his willingness to go at a time such as this tells us of the confidence that he had in the promises of God. And that's what pilgrims have to do. Pilgrims don't typically get to stay with their family unless the whole family goes as well. But what God said to Abraham is that's not going to happen in this case. You have to leave your father's house. Pilgrims don't often, and sometimes never, get to return back to their homeland. Sometimes they never see their family again. That's kind of the story of American pilgrims in the time of Thanksgiving, right? When the conditions were harsh, they didn't just jump on an airplane and go back home. or even that slow-moving boat. They didn't just go back during the winter. That's the part of the mindset of a pilgrim, is that things are not easy, things are not comfortable, but we're here, and we're staying here while we can. And so this, Abraham and Sarah illustrate the role that their confidence played, because confidence was mingled and mixed with their faith. Go back now to Hebrews chapter 11. But the fact that someone has confidence mixed with their faith doesn't mean there's never any question or never any doubt that might start to trickle in sometime. Hebrews 11:17 through 19. Abraham had some questions that he didn't have a total answer to. Hebrews 11:17, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called. Notice this, concluding that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. Here's a point that relates to their confidence in heaven and a city. Abraham was confident in resurrection. He already had this idea of the dead being raised. And so he was confident that God could raise Isaac. But what this says is that was what he concluded. God, of course, did not tell Abraham, go kill your son and then I'll raise him from the dead. What this tells us is Abraham at least scratched his head for a few minutes, wondering, well, wait a minute. Well, God, how can you tell me to go kill my son? This is the son through whom you've made the promises. How's that going to work out? Abraham spent some time thinking about how these things could go together. That they seem to contradict each other. And so he worked through that in his mind. How's that possible? How's God going to do that? And in this case, he was able to come up with an answer that he felt comfortable with. Okay, I'll go do it first because God said to, but his conscience was a little bit eased, and his feelings were smoothed out a little bit by realizing, okay, I think I know what God's going to do. I think God's going to raise him from the dead. Okay, I can get up early in the morning and go do this. The fact that he had to try to figure out an answer for why and how tells us Abraham had a little bit of doubt, not doubting that God existed, but just some questions, some uncertainty about what he knew God had said. And so, do you ever have doubts? Do you ever have questions? Well, I thought this was true, but now I don't know. Did I misunderstand something? Did I miss something somewhere? I'm a little bit confused. That doesn't mean that your faith is weak. It doesn't mean that you don't have faith. It just means that uncertainty or doubts don't conquer what we believe. In other words, what we don't know doesn't change what we do know. That's how you can have some doubt, but also faith, as long as you don't let what you don't know change what you do know. And why would we do that? Just because I don't know the answer to a math problem doesn't mean I just quit doing math. It just means I don't understand that one yet. But if I keep working on my addition and subtraction and multiplication and division, eventually I might be able to figure that out. Or I might just spend the rest of my life saying that equation that was on the board, I just couldn't figure that one out. But I know enough to know I know something, just because I don't know everything. You see, faith can continue with some doubt. We know who, because we know who, even when we don't know why, or we don't know when, or we don't know how. That was a part of the struggle of Abraham and Sarah's faith. And yet, here they are in Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, they endured because of their confidence, the assurance that they had in the promises of God. They never gave that up. They may have had some questions, but they never gave up that confidence. Second, they were content with the promises that God made. They were content with what God promised. They recognized, okay, out of all things, the things that God has said and done and promised, we have no better offer. They had some good offers. If they had stayed in Ur, in their original home, they had a pretty comfortable life there. We'll look at that in just a minute. But verse 13, again, they were assured of and embraced the promises, and therefore they confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims. Have you ever been made an offer that you could refuse? Sure. Well, why would you refuse an offer? That's because you either already have a better offer or you expect to have a better offer. And so Abraham and Sarah confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims because God had made an offer that they knew was better than anything that any city or any family member or any of the creature comforts that they had was better than anything that could be offered to them or that they already had. They believed, verse 16, that heavenly country was better than any earthly landscape where they already were or where they could go. And so they were content with the heavenly city and country and promises. And therefore, verse 15, we read it, but let me read it again to you to emphasize something here. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. Abraham knew the way back to Haran, where he left, and then he knew the way back from there to Ur. And so the Hebrew writer says, if they had just thought about that and dwelt upon that and thought about how good things used to be back where they used to be, they would have had opportunities to go back. But they didn't. But why might they have looked back? Who do we think about when we think of looking back? Why did she look back, Lot's wife? Because home was back there. And people they loved were back there. And if they had thought more and constantly about who was back there and what was back there, then what might they have done? If that was what they focused on, that's where they might have gone. But they didn't consider that their true home, their permanent home. There was also ease back there where they had left. Abraham and Sarah spent much of their lives traveling, primarily living in tents from that point of their life on. But that was not the life that they left in Ur when God called Abram out of Ur of the Chaldees. Here's where people who dig around in the dirt and the sand believe that Ur is located. So you see the Dead Sea over there. That's where Canaan would be. And so Ur of the Chaldees, they've dug around there enough to have a pretty good idea of what the city was, not just at some time in the past, but they can even date it to this is just a drawing, but this was what Ur looked like during the time that Abraham lived. So here's where Abram was when God originally called him. Not a bad place to live. This is where they had spent much of their life. This is what was normal to them. It was a large city, a wealthy city. They built their homes with mud or stone, maybe sun-dried bricks of some sort. So this, you can tell, is an actual photograph. I think it's taken from this temple here in the middle, or maybe one of these larger buildings has been preserved over the years. So here's a photograph taken from the middle of the city out into the suburbs, as we might say. And these structures here that you see, now here's from the opposite perspective. So here were average common homes. And what I want to help you compare this to is what Abram and Sarah would have lived in. Would you trade your house that you're in now for the most expensive, luxurious, comfortable tent that money can buy? I mean, it's the best, the best tent that's out there. Would you trade it for your home? No. That's what they did. Abraham and Sarah lived in a city like this, the urban Ur, and they traded in presumably a brick home for the rural countryside of Canaan. and the temporary homes and the tents in which they lived. We probably wouldn't make that trade, but if we had reason enough to do it, we might. But if we did, would you ever think about what that leather sofa and that temperature-controlled living room, would you ever call to mind how good it was back before you traded your home for a tent? You might go back there in your minds on occasion, and yet if every single day that's what you talked about and thought about and dreamt about, then eventually you're probably going to go back. Abram and Sarah had all those same things in their mind of the comfortable, stable life that they left. Well, then why didn't they go back? They could have. Because they were content with the promises. And so they didn't look back. Content, they found a way to be content with the promises that God had made. They were confident in them. They were no fairy tale or dream. They were content with them. They weren't looking for something better from the past or the present or future. And so last then, they were strangers. They were pilgrims because they concentrated on, go back to Hebrews 11 if you haven't left, or if you have left, they kept their focus on the promises that God had made. Verse 14, they declared plainly that they were seeking a homeland. They'd never been to their homeland. Wasn't their homeland. Haran, where their family wasn't their homeland. And even Canaan. They got to go to the land, but they were still seeking a homeland. Well, weren't they there? That's where God told them to go. No, they were seeking a homeland. Verse 16, a heavenly city that God had prepared for them. Go down to verse 26 in Hebrews chapter 11. This is about Moses, but there's a particular word here that I think is helpful and that describes Abram and Sarah as well. You remember verse 25 about the passing pleasures of sin that Moses refused. Verse 26, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. Underline, just with your mind or with a pen if you like to make notes, that word looked. He looked to the reward. We use the word look to mean a lot of different things. If I glance over there and then look back, well, I looked over there. Just a quick glance. This word looked, though, is more specific. It's a specific kind of looking. It's a focus. In fact, there's a lesser-known translation that translates it this way, that he fixed his gaze on the reward. That's a little bit different than he just looked, right? Because he wasn't looking around. He had looked around. And there were treasures and there were pleasures, but he looked to the reward. Meaning he had to look away from the other things. That's what Abraham and Sarah did. They desired a heavenly country, and so they had to avoid looking, in other words, focusing on certain things. And they had the same kind of lures of the world around them that you and I do. And so they had to decide, well, there's a treasure here, and there's a pleasure here. And if those became more desirable than a heavenly treasure and a heavenly pleasure, then that's the direction that they would have gone. If they had been deceived and distracted by the cares of this world, the pleasures of this life, the deceitfulness of riches, that's the language of the parable of the sower. If they had been distracted by those things, then how different would their life have been? What decision would they have made if their gaze and their eyes were focused on treasures and pleasures? How different would their decision have been when God told them to leave their home, to leave their family, and go to a place, and I'm not telling you yet where you're going? If their eyes are on earthly treasures and pleasures, that's an easy decision. I'm not going. How different would their decision have been when the time came that Abram and his family and his servants could no longer live beside Lot and his servants. How different would Abraham's decision have been if earthly pleasures and treasures were his focus? Where would he have ended up? In the well-watered plain of Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities. How different would Abraham's life have been if that's where he went? Boy, you've got a totally different story, a totally different life. What if it's Ishmael, or what if it's Isaac that is then born there, and Isaac turns out like the daughters of Lot? Whole different story. Why didn't that happen? Abraham let Lot pick, and he just said, I'll just go the other way. Why? Because he wasn't all that concerned about where he went next, because wherever he went next isn't where he was going. He was just a pilgrim. When God told Abraham to leave the land that he had sent him to, God sent him to Canaan, but then there was a time where God sent him away from Canaan. So if Abraham's focus, if Sarah's eyes were fixed upon, well, we finally made it here, we're going to put our roots down, and we're not budging, we're not moving, that's where their eyes were. They wouldn't have left when God told them to leave, and their life takes a different turn. Or when God told Abraham to kill his only son, to whom the promises had been made. If Abraham's life was wrapped up and wrapped around first and foremost in family, his life was wrapped up in family, no doubt, but not first. But if family had been his first focus once he got to the land of Canaan, and God tells him to kill his son, he's not going to do it. The only reason he would do it, Hebrews 11 tells us, is by faith. And then when Sarah dies, and Abraham has to move to a new phase of life, a very different kind of life. Again, if family came first, then what does he do? And why is he doing the things that he used to do? He used to do them for her. But she's not there. So now what does he do? And why does he do it? His life maybe goes a very different direction. But you know the story, because you know the life of Abraham. Why did he make the decisions that he did in this or that? Hebrews 11 has the answer, because he looked to the same reward that Moses looked to. And so in all of these temporary places and people and decisions that he had to make, he looked to the reward because of the promises that God made to him. He was confident in those promises. He was content with those promises. And he concentrated on those promises. And he never changed. He had some questions, but his answers never changed. And if we'll think in the same way that he did, then by faith we can do the same kinds of things that he did. Our specifics, of course, are different than his. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight and think about tonight, that we too, knowing the promises of God, if we will be confident in and content with and concentrate first upon those promises, then the city and the heavenly country that God prepared for Abraham and Sarah, we'll move there too. We'll live there too. And so if you can be with us tonight at 5:30, that'll be our focus. For now, though, turn to number 338. Where are you, and where are you going? Your parents can't make that decision for you. Your children can't make that decision for you. Your descendants and your ancestors can't make that decision for you, because one day they won't be your family anymore. When you die, things change. You're going to face, though, the God in whose image you are made. That can be a day that you look forward to and rejoice in, as Abraham and Sarah did, and sing this song with that joy and with that hope. If you're here and you know that you're not a Christian, that you're not a pilgrim, you haven't been living that way, then you need your sins forgiven. And God will call you a pilgrim and a saint and a disciple and a Christian. Confess the faith that you have, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, if you know. And if you're ready to be baptized into Christ and buried with Him, you'll be raised with Him with this hope. Or if as a Christian we can encourage you, help you in serving Him or returning to Him, tell us how we could help as we stand and sing.